So for strength, I guess training frequency.
Frequency.
So
cool.
what should determine training frequency? And I had the great benefit of a long time ago when I was in high school, actually, I paid for a session over the phone with Mike Menser.
Oh, lovely.
The Mike Menser.
Sure.
And we got to be friends
High intensity
over time.
training.
At the time, I was pretty young, and my mother kept saying, like, why is this like grown man calling the house? And we would talk all the time about training, but he tried to convince me to train once every 5 to 7 days, very few sets, very high intensity. And I must say, it worked incredibly well.
Sure.
It was, I think with my recovery quotient, which was not very good, I think has improved over time, but was not very good. It was remarkable. But of course, this was a time when I was,
full of the most anabolism
14,
you've
I was
ever had in your
on
life.
my own version of anabolics, right? I was really I had a long arc of puberty.
And you were untrained.
And I was mostly untrained. I've been running cross country
works.
and skateboarding and playing soccer.
And doing all the things that are like the antithesis of growing muscle.
It was literally, and people will probably say impossible, it was something like 40 pounds of muscle inside of 12 months. It was crazy.
I would believe that.
And so then of course that stopped working over time.
Shocker.
And then you start going down the odyssey of trying to find the thing that's going to work that well. And you eventually realize that it was because you were untrained, right? So training frequency is crucial. Let's say that people are doing these whole body workouts as you've described them, not alternating upper body, lower body, because there's so many different splits that probably doesn't make sense to go into splits in right now. But how often can and should one train a muscle? And how do you know if a muscle is recovered locally? And how do you know if your nervous system is recovered systemically?
Okay, this is a bunch of really interesting questions. I'm not sure exactly what route you want to go, so I'll start here. As I mentioned earlier, soreness is not a good barometer of exercise quality because some types of training are going to induce more soreness and some are going to induce less. That's important to this conversation because when you ask about how do you know if a muscle is ready to train again, one of the questions is, well, what are you training for? If you're training for hypertrophy, right, muscle size, muscle growth, we need to hedge towards recovery because what you're trying to do is cause a massive insult there, allow then protein synthesis to occur, building of new tissue, which takes time, 48 to 72 hours, like kind of at a minimum, that process needs to occur. If you're doing actually more strength, and this is a differentiation between hypertrophy and strength, then you didn't induce actually much damage. In fact, you're generally not going to get very sore from true strength training. Very little, unless you get really heavy, you did it a lot. The primary driver of hypertrophy is not the same primary driver of strength. We talked about that already. That's intensity driven. For hypertrophy, it's not intensity. So because we have different mechanisms, we have different outcomes, even though they're closely aligned, strength is not going to cause a lot of soreness. Therefore, intensity is the driver. Therefore, frequency can be as high as you want. So you can train every single day the same exact muscle if speed or power or strength are the primary training tools because you need stimulus there. Skill as well, right? Practice. That you know that as much as anybody. Developing a new motor pattern requires a lot of repetitions, right? You don't need a tremendous amount of rest. It's not a damage thing, right? It's a repatterning issue. So strength training, in fact, if you look at, again, true strength professional athletes, they're going to train the same muscles basically every day.
Wow.
They're going to squat every day.
And is that because the primary mode of adaptation is recruitment of these high threshold motor units? It's mainly neural.
No. So everyone's going to say that, and this is where I get all feisty.
Well, I'm not saying that. That was actually, there was a question mark there.
Okay.
If we were online putting comments, there would be a question mark.
We would have fought.
Yeah.
I would have blocked you. I was just kidding.
I think you already blocked me. No.
Probably twice. Okay. The early adaptations to exercise, especially strength training, are hedged towards the nervous system. No question about it. People always say central nervous system, but it's probably more peripheral. Right? Whatever. Semantics probably, but pedantic. It's nervous. If you train today, tomorrow morning, you're not going to wake up with a actually increase in contractile proteins in muscle. Your muscle might be a little bit bigger due to some acute swelling, but you could have a pretty acute that persists change in the nervous system, we'll call it, that allows you to be stronger like within a couple of days. Sustained hypertrophy is probably more along the lines of 4 weeks where we can see that, right? We can actually see changes like in the ultrasound. Now you're making changes immediately. That protein synthesis process is happening like very fast. And it's going to last. It just takes us time to measure it in terms of a noticeable change in your whole muscle size. So that being said, the first 4 weeks we typically will say are primarily nervous system. After that, now we're starting to see most of the changes coming from the muscle side of the equation. So with strength development, it's a combination of 3 areas. In fact, all muscle contraction has these same 3 things. It starts off with some signal, right, from somewhere in the body, whether it's all the way up the top or at the level of the spine, depending on if this is a reaction or an actual conscious control. From there, that some signal has to tell the muscle to contract. Okay, so signal is 1. 2, it's muscular contraction. And there's a lot of variables inside the muscle tissue itself that determine its functionality. And so if we took an individual biopsy and took a muscle fiber from you and took one from me, and we took those muscles out and put them in a petri dish, and I tied one end to a force transducer and the other end to a thing that pulls it, and we soaked it in a bath of calcium and a bunch of other stuff, even if they were the same size, your fibers might contract a lot faster than mine, even relative to size. Or not, or slower, or there's various properties. So the intrinsic fibers themselves determine a lot of functionality. From there, muscle fibers don't cause movements. Muscle fibers simply contract. They're all surrounded with connective tissue, and that's all surrounded with a bunch of more connective tissue. And that all surrounds into a muscle. That muscle is then surrounded with more connective tissue. That all comes together into a giant tendon. That tendon attaches to the bone. It's the pulling on those tendon that actually move the bone that cause human movement. So that's area 3. Area 1, the nervous system. Area 2, the muscle contraction. Area 3, some sort of connective tissue thing. Changes happen at all 3 of those levels. And we're not even now talking, well, even you entered the discussion of biomechanics and you changed, say, the pennation angle of the muscle, which is the angle at which the muscle fibers lay relative to the bone, right? So this is basic mechanics. Is it pulling perpendicular to the bone? Is it pulling horizontal to the bone, or some sort of angle? All of these things determine human performance. So when you're talking about, again, that strength development, you can see tremendous improvements in total force production by manipulating all of those areas, and you have not touched changes in muscle size. If you change muscle size in a true sustained fashion, whether this is sarcoplasmic or contractile proteins, you have given yourself more opportunity to produce more force. It doesn't guarantee you produce more force. Bodybuilders are not stronger than powerlifters, even though they have more muscle. But bodybuilders are probably stronger than most people. So there is a relationship between muscle size and strength. It's just not a 1-to-1 guaranteed ratio. And that's generally because although the muscle has been aided, they may have not changed the biomechanical considerations. They may have not changed the connective tissue, nor the nervous system stuff. And so that's why we see this giant relationship that R value is pretty high between strength and hypertrophy. But if you really want to get to the ends of it, it's not. And that matters to your actual question 10 minutes ago, because again, you can train strength daily on the same muscle. But if you want to allow for that process of contractile proteins to add and grow, then you're going to have to allow some recovery. Because if you go back into that muscle too soon, you're going to blunt the response. You're going to stop it. You're going to cut it off. You have all kinds of problems going on in the cell that are going to just attenuate that growth response. So I gave you the answer for strength training. The answer for hypertrophy is probably less than 3 out of 10 on level of soreness. You can go again. In general, you're probably looking at 72 hours is the optimal window. So if you trained your shoulders on Monday, you probably don't want to train them again on Tuesday. If hypertrophy is the goal, maybe Wednesday, maybe Thursday's best. So something like an every 2 to 3 day window is probably, and we know a little bit more now about why that is. The gene cascade, the signaling response happens, the signaling happens instantaneously, right? Within seconds. The gene cascade is probably peaked in the 4-hour window, like depending on which gene you want to look at, but it's just kind of a snapshot. But the protein synthesis process is 24 to 48 hour thing. And so it tends to kind of look like let that thing finish and let that signal go back to baseline and then hit it again and then hit it again. And now as long as you're providing the nutrients, the recovery should happen and you should be able to sustain the same work output in the training session. So the stimulus stays high and the recovery's there and you can now continue to grow muscle.
You mentioned 48 to 72 hours for hypertrophy. What if, for whatever reasons, the training split, lifestyle factors, et cetera, somebody, say, let's use your example, trains shoulders on Monday, Ideally, they would train them again on Thursday
Yep.
in their particular instance, somewhere Wednesday or Thursday, but they don't. They wait until Saturday or Sunday for whatever reason. Maybe it's more compatible with their work and other exercise schedule, whatever the reason. Are they actually losing hypertrophy that they gained, or they've missed a window to induce further hypertrophy?
It's probably better to think about it the latter. It's not that you've lost, it's just you've just kind of lost an opportunity to make more progress. I will save you a little bit, and kind of going back to your HIIT program. This is the original high intensity training, the Menser thing, right? Which is not
the HIIT with one eye, not the high intensity interval training, but high intensity training. Like
Correct.
one set to absolute failure,
Totally.
maybe two for each muscle group.
20-minute workouts.
Dividing your body into a three-way split, and then literally training
Smashing.
like 6 times a month, which most people think that is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
There's no way that's going to work. And I can tell you,
It does.
if you are untrained, you grow like a weed.
Just
If you train hard enough. and
even
you
if you're
rest
trained, look at the people who Mike trained. He put a lot of bodybuilders on really high levels. Now, they had the same similar help you had at that time frame.
Wait, to be very clear, I was not taking exogenous anabolics. In fact,
No, but your
I
endogenous was just as good.
I probably was. I wasn't measuring my levels there, but I probably would. I grew easy. And in general, I tend to grow pretty easily from weight training. But and I should say that to Mike's credit, and I think this is an important message, that he was the one who really said, look, unless you're going to make a professional career out of it, do not run the health hazards of exogenous hormones. It's certainly not at your age. So he deterred me from that, which was great because it never entered my mind. It just was one of those things where Mike Menser said, don't do it. And he had clearly done it, right? Obviously. And so he's speaking from an informed place. It never entered my mind. But also what was really wild is I was continuing to run cross country. And so there was a trade-off there at some point.
A bit of an interference.
But when you're young, you can many people can get away with what at this age would surely place me into a state of overtraining, even at low volume. We'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the whole field on interference effect has changed quite a bit recently, which we could come back to if you want. But just to finish out the idea here with that last question, if you want to take 5 days or 6 days in between each muscle group, you can do that. In fact, if you look at the research, it's going to show that frequency is not that important. Well, it's not that it's unimportant, but it can handle changes as long as you get to the same total volume. So you can do that. You just have to do a lot more work in that one workout. If you care about the 6-week, 8-week thing, if you're like, I'm in this for the next 60 years, it's probably okay, right? But it can be there. The challenge with splitting up your training sessions for hypertrophy into smaller numbers, like once or twice a week, it's just difficult to get that number. It's difficult to get that volume done. Volume-wise, the more recent meta-analyses are going to say that you're probably looking at around 10 working sets per muscle group per week. Seems to be kind of the minimum threshold that you're going to want to hit. So if you did 3 sets of 10 at your shoulders on Monday, 3 sets of 10 shoulders Wednesday, and 3 on Friday, that's 9 working sets. If you wanted to do 3 different shoulder work exercises on Monday and hit your 9 sets, it's not really actually going to be that much different. The problem is 10 is kind of the minimum. You probably want to look for more like 15 to 20, and in fact, well-trained folks, 20, 25. That becomes very challenging in one workout. In fact, defuncto, you're not going to be able to do it, right? And so that is where it's not the frequency that looks like it kills you. It's just the fact you have got to get, because the total driver of strength is intensity, but the total driver of hypertrophy is volume. Assumed you're taking it to fatigue, right, or muscular failure. So it's just tough to get enough done. If you can, and if you want to set your schedule up that way, like you probably remember, if you do those types of training sessions where you're just going to completely exhaust a muscle, it's going to be it's going to be sore for a while. You're probably not going to come back, and that's sort of the logic behind that was, let's take this thing to tremendous failure and give it 6 days to recover. It can work. It's just not the best, I think, is one way to think about it for most people.
It's also hard to do those workouts without a training partner if you really want to do them correctly.
And stimulants and headphones and all kinds of other things, right?
Stimulants are not, I certainly don't recommend those. Maybe a cup of coffee or two if that's your thing, but and maybe some of the safer supplements. But Certainly not the
Yeah.
sorts of stimulants that the guys in the 70s and 80s were
No way.
famous
Or
for
still
taking
use.
or
Yeah.
still use.